Frank Sullivan, a 71-year-old Marine veteran, shares an unbreakable bond with Bravo, his aging military dog who saved lives in Fallujah. Mocked by young men for talking to Bravo in the park, Frank faces humiliation as a viral video spreads, labeling him crazy. Undeterred, he remains devoted to Bravo, despite eviction threats and the dog's declining health. As Frank struggles to save Bravo from seizures, their story takes a mysterious turn. Who are the Marines approaching in a black SUV? Will society recognize the loyalty of this veteran and his heroic dog? The truth awaits. Join us at Incredible Stories to honor heroes like Frank and Bravo. Subscribe to preserve their unforgettable tales of loyalty and sacrifice. Your support ensures these powerful memories inspire future generations. Hit subscribe, share your story, and help us keep their legacy alive. Together, let's never forget. Frank Sullivan, a weathered man of 71, sat quietly on a familiar park bench, his gnarled hands resting gently on the head of his aging dog, Bravo. The autumn breeze tugged at the edges of his worn jacket, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant memories. Frank's voice, low and steady, wove a soft tapestry of words meant only for Bravo, who lay with his graying muzzle nestled in Frank's lap. The dog's eyes, clouded by cataracts, seemed to hold a quiet understanding, as if every syllable from Frank's lips carried the weight of their shared past. To passers-by, it might have looked like an old man lost in a one-sided conversation, but to Frank it was a ritual of loyalty, a communion forged in the crucible of war. Not far off, a cluster of young men lounged near a picnic table, their laughter slicing through the park's calm. Their eyes locked onto Frank, and their amusement grew sharper, crueler. "Look at this guy," one of them snorted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Talking to his dog like it's going to answer back. What a nutcase." Another pulled out his phone, the camera lens glinting as he recorded Frank's quiet murmurs. The group's laughter swelled, each chuckle a breath at the old man's solitude. "This lonely vet's having a full-blown chat with his mutt," the one with the phone said, already imagining the likes and shares the video would rake in. They couldn't know, the depth of the bond they were ridiculing. Frank, oblivious to their taunts, leaned closer to Bravo, his voice a gentle rumble. "You remember that night outside Ramadi, boy? Sand so thick it choked the air. But you kept your nose down, didn't you? Never flinched." His fingers traced the dog's scarred ears, and his heart ached with pride and sorrow. Bravo's tail gave a faint thump, a ghost of the vigorous wag from younger days. Frank's mind drifted to Fallujah, to the blistering heat and the constant dread of unseen threats. Bravo, a military working dog trained to sniff out explosives, had been his shadow through 3 grueling tours. In 2000, during a patrol that could have been their last, Bravo's keen senses had uncovered a network of hidden IEDs, saving 4 Marines from certain death. That moment had sealed their bond, a pact stronger than steel. Frank had fought tooth and nail to bring Bravo home after the war. Military regulations were cold and unyielding. Working dogs were to stay in service or go to handlers with proper facilities. But Frank couldn't bear the thought of leaving Bravo behind. "We came in together," he'd told his commanding officer, his voice cracking with determination. "We leave together." He'd called in every favor, filled out endless forms, and pleaded with anyone who'd listen until Bravo was finally his. Now, in their twilight years, they shared a modest apartment, 2 old warriors leaning on each other against the weight of time. Every morning, Frank and Bravo made their pilgrimage to the park. The same bench welcomed them, its chipped paint and creaking slats as familiar as an old friend. Frank would pull out a dog-eared paperback, reading aloud to Bravo or sharing stories of their past. "Feel that breeze, boy?" he'd say, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Reminds me of those quiet nights in the desert when the stars were all we had." Bravo, though half-deaf and slowed by arthritis, would tilt his head, his clouded eyes fixed on Frank as if hanging on every word. Sometimes Frank's voice would soften, laced with reassurance when Bravo's breathing grew uneven. "You're still here, old man. We've got time yet." On this crisp Tuesday, the young men's mockery grew bolder. Their phones captured every moment of Frank's quiet exchange with Bravo, their laughter a harsh counterpoint to his gentle words. Yo, check this out, one called, waving his friends over. Grandpa thinks his dog's gonna talk back. This is gold. The video, hastily uploaded, spread like wildfire, branded with a caption that stung like a slap. Crazy old vet, best friend is a dog who can't even understand him. Frank, lost in his memories, didn't notice the growing crowd or the whispers that followed. By afternoon, the park manager, a wiry man with a nervous frown, approached Frank. His footsteps crunched on the gravel, and Frank looked up, sensing the unease in the man's posture. "Mr. Sullivan," the manager began, his voice tight. "We've had some complaints about you, talking to yourself. It's making folks uncomfortable." Frank's gaze didn't waver, though a flicker of hurt passed through his eyes. "I'm not talking to myself," he said evenly. "I'm talking to my dog." The manager shifted, his hands twisting together. "Right, well, maybe you could do that at home. Some parents are worried about their kids seeing unusual behavior." Frank's jaw tightened, but he nodded, swallowing the sting of judgment. He'd faced worse, far worse, than sidelong glances and whispered gossip. In Fallujah, he'd stared down death itself with Bravo at his side. A few cruel words were nothing. Slowly he gathered his things, his book tucked under his arm. Bravo, sensing the shift, struggled to his feet, his joints protesting with every movement. The dog's determination mirrored Frank's own, a quiet resolve to stay by his side no matter the cost. "It's all right, boy," Frank murmured, his hand resting on Bravo's head. "They can laugh all they want. You never left me when the shells were falling." Bravo pressed his muzzle against Frank's palm, a gesture that spoke of trust unbroken by time or infirmity. Frank's heart swelled with a fierce, protective love. He thought of the nights when Bravo's alertness had been their only shield, the dog's steady presence a lifeline in the chaos of war. "You're the only one who gets it, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Together, they moved toward the park's exit, Frank's steps deliberate, Bravo's halting but loyal. The young men's laughter faded into the background, irrelevant against the weight of their shared history. 3 hours later, the park's quiet was broken by the low rumble of a black SUV pulling up to the curb. 5 Marines stepped out, their uniforms sharp, their movements precise. Without a word, they approached Frank, who had returned to the bench, Bravo still at his side. The old man looked up, his eyes widening with surprise as the Marines snapped to attention and saluted in perfect unison. Frank's throat tightened, memories of camaraderie and honor flooding back. The gesture spoke louder than any apology, a tribute to a man and his dog whose loyalty had given them everything. The jeering laughter of the young men dwindled into the distance, their cruel taunts echoing faintly as they wandered off. "If you think a good person deserves a hero's memory, then stick around with us," one had sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. Their words stung, but Frank had long since learned to let such barbs slide off his weathered skin. His focus was elsewhere, on the slow, steady steps of Bravo, the loyal dog plodding beside him, whose every movement carried the weight of shared history. 2 weeks had passed since that humiliating day in the park, where their quiet moment had been twisted into a viral spectacle. Now a fresh wound arrived in the form of a cold, impersonal eviction notice from the veteran-subsidized housing complex that had been Frank's fragile anchor. The letter was blunt: unauthorized pet maintenance and failure to provide documentation proving Bravo's status as a service animal. Frank's heart sank as he read the words, each one a bureaucratic jab at the bond he shared with his companion. He had submitted the paperwork not once but 3 times, each attempt swallowed by the slow grind of administrative indifference. Bravo's military records, tied to classified operations from their time in service, were locked away in some untouchable vault. Every appeal Frank sent vanished into a void of red tape, leaving him with nothing but frustration and a growing sense of helplessness. With no family to lean on and a pension that barely stretched to cover his basic needs, Frank faced a stark reality. He sold what little he owned, a few trinkets, a worn watch, a couple of medals that meant more to him than their monetary value, and scraped together enough to buy an old, creaking RV. It wasn't much, but it was freedom, a way to escape the suffocating walls of a system that seemed to care so little for him or Bravo. He drove the RV to a quiet spot near the lake where he and Bravo had trained years ago, before their deployments to places that still haunted Frank's dreams. The lake was more than a body of water. It was a sanctuary, a place where the world felt right, where memories of purpose and camaraderie lingered in the rustling leaves and gentle ripples. Here, Frank could breathe. Every morning, he and Bravo walked the lake's perimeter, their steps synchronized despite the dog's increasingly labored gait. Bravo's health was fading, his once powerful frame now frail, his breaths heavy with effort. Yet his eyes still burned with the same unwavering loyalty that had carried them through the darkest nights of their past. Frank matched his pace to Bravo's, each step a quiet vow to stay by his side, just as Bravo had always done for him. The world might have turned its back, but they had each other. One frigid morning, as the air bit at Frank's knuckles and the ground crunched beneath his boots, Bravo's legs buckled. The dog collapsed, his body racked with violent seizures. Panic surged through Frank, a raw, primal fear that clawed at his chest. He dropped to his knees, gathering Bravo's trembling form into his arms. The dog's warmth a stark contrast to the cold dread pooling in his gut. He stumbled to his feet, cradling Bravo like a child, and rushed to the nearest veterinary clinic, his heart pounding with a desperation he hadn't felt since the battlefield. Bursting through the door, he approached the receptionist, his voice thick with urgency. "Please, he needs help now. I don't have much money, but I'll work it off. Anything you need. Just save him." The young woman behind the counter barely glanced up from her screen, her expression flat, detached. "We don't offer charity services," she said, her tone clipped. "There's an animal shelter across town that does low-cost euthanasia if that's what you're after." The word hit Frank like a physical blow. Euthanasia. His voice broke, a rare crack in the stoic facade he'd built over years of hardship. "I'm not here to put him down. I want to save him." But the receptionist's response was unyielding. "Treatment requires payment up front. It's policy." Defeated but unbroken, Frank sank into a chair in the waiting area, Bravo's trembling body still cradled in his arms. He didn't cry. Tears were a luxury he'd forsaken long ago, trained out of him by a life that demanded resilience. Instead, his calloused hands moved with a tenderness born of deep love, stroking Bravo's fur in slow, rhythmic motions, as if he could will strength back into the dog's failing body. The world around him faded, the sterile hum of the clinic drowned out by the weight of his memories. He saw Bravo as he once was, fearless, bounding through dust-choked fields, ears alert, ready to protect at a moment's notice. That dog had been his anchor, his reason to keep going when the world felt like it was collapsing. Unbeknownst to Frank, a teenager loitering in the clinic recognized him from the viral video that had turned their lives into a cruel joke. The boy, eager for clout, pulled out his phone and started recording, capturing Frank's quiet devotion with a smirk. "Dog whisperer still having heart-to-hearts with his four-legged therapist," he muttered, uploading the clip with a caption that would fuel another wave of online mockery. By evening, the internet was alight with new memes, each one more vicious than the last. When your only friend has four legs and your crazy vet thinks Pato understands war stories. The comments piled up, thousands of strangers laughing at a bond they couldn't begin to comprehend. Frank didn't see them. He didn't need to. The world's cruelty was nothing new, and he had long since stopped caring what others thought of him. All that mattered was Bravo. Back at the RV, Frank wrapped Bravo in his own jacket, the worn fabric a small shield against the cold gnawed air. He stayed awake, watching the rise and fall of the dog's chest, each breath a fragile thread, tying them to another moment together. In a quiet act of sacrifice, Frank crushed his own pain medication, meant to ease the ache of his arthritis, into Bravo's water, prioritizing his companion's comfort over his own. "Hold on, buddy," he whispered, his voice low and steady, a lifeline in the dark. "We've survived worse, haven't we? Remember those nights outside Fallujah? You kept me warm then. My turn now." The memories flooded back, huddled together under a starless sky, the distant rumble of artillery, Bravo's steady presence a reminder that they weren't alone. Those moments had forged a bond stronger than steel, one that no eviction notice or internet troll could break. What the mockers never noticed was the tag dangling from Bravo's worn collar. It wasn't a pet tag, but a military identification, K99 USMC 40521, saved 4 lives, Purple Heart recipient. Fewer still would understand why Frank still addressed Bravo by his rank, his voice soft but firm. Steady, Corporal. Easy now. To Frank, Bravo wasn't just a dog. He was a Marine, a comrade who had never been discharged from duty, who had faced the same horrors and carried the same scars. They were soldiers together, bound by a code that transcended species, a loyalty that no one else could fathom. The next day, with his pension nearly depleted, Frank sought out a sympathetic feed store clerk who slipped him a bottle of antibiotics. It wasn't the proper veterinary care Bravo deserved, but it was all Frank could afford. He administered the medicine with care, his hands steady despite the ache in his joints, his heart heavy with the knowledge that time was slipping away. As Bravo's condition worsened, Frank sat beside him in the RV, the world outside reduced to a distant hum. He spoke softly, recounting their shared past, not for Bravo, who knew it all, but for himself, to hold on to the moments that had defined them. The lake, the training grounds, the nights of quiet vigilance. They were more than memories. They were proof of a life lived with purpose, a life shared with a friend who had never let him down. Frank sat outside his weathered RV, the sun casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the RV park. In his calloused hands, he held a tattered paperback, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. His voice, gravelly but steady, carried the words of an old adventure novel, each syllable carefully chosen to soothe the labored breathing of Bravo, the aging German shepherd lying at his side. Bravo's once powerful frame was now frail, his fur patchy and his eyes clouded with pain. Frank read aloud, just as he had during those long-ago nights when thunderstorms rumbled like distant artillery, their echoes stirring memories of battlefields neither man nor dog could fully leave behind. The rhythm of the story was a lifeline, a way to anchor them both against the chaos of the world and the fragility of Bravo's fading strength. Frank's heart ached as he glanced at his companion, the bay who had once bounded through war zones with fearless loyalty. Now, every shallow breath Bravo took felt like a countdown, and Frank's chest tightened with the weight of it. A jogger passed by, her sneakers pounding the pavement in a hurried rhythm. She glanced at Frank, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. An old man in a faded flannel shirt, sitting on a folding chair, reading to a dog that looked more dead than alive. Her lips curled slightly, and she muttered under her breath, "That weird homeless vet." The words stung, though Frank didn't flinch. He'd heard worse over the years, whispers, judgments, the dismissive glances of people who saw only a disheveled old man and not the soldier who'd once carried a rifle and a nation's hopes. He didn't expect them to understand the bond he shared with Bravo, forged in the crucible of war, where trust was measured in split-second decisions and unwavering loyalty. Civilians, he thought, could never grasp the weight of those moments. His only concern was Bravo, whose opinion was the only one that mattered. The dog's eyes, though dim, still held a flicker of recognition, and Frank clung to that like a lifeline, his own resolve hardening against the indifference of the world. 3 hours later, the quiet of the RV park was shattered by the arrival of an unmarked black SUV, its government plates gleaming under the midday sun. The vehicle pulled up with precision, its engine cutting off with the kind of efficiency that spoke of military discipline. 5 Marines stepped out, their dress blues crisp and immaculate, a stark contrast to the dust and wear of Frank's world. Their movements were synchronized, each step purposeful, their faces etched with a solemnity that carried the weight of duty. The oldest, a master sergeant with a chest full of combat ribbons that told stories of courage and sacrifice, led the group. His eyes, sharp and steady, scanned the RV as if assessing a battlefield. The others, Lieutenant Harris, Corporal Martinez, Lance Corporal Wilson, and Private First Class Dawson, followed in formation, their expressions a mix of respect and determination. They weren't here for show. They were here for a mission. The Master Sergeant, Reynolds, approached the RV and knocked firmly on the door, the sound sharp in the still air. "Mr. Frank Sullivan," he called, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of reverence. Frank, still cradling Bravo in one arm, opened the door slowly. Confusion flickered across his weathered face as he took in the sight of the uniformed men. His mind raced, trying to make sense of their presence. Had he done something wrong? Was this about the videos, those fleeting, judgmental clips that had spread across the internet, capturing his quiet moments with Bravo? He stood straight at her, his grip on Bravo tightening instinctively, as if shielding his old friend from whatever this was. Reynolds raised his hand in a perfect salute, his posture rigid with respect. "Sir," he began, "I'm Master Sergeant Reynolds. With me are Lieutenant Harris, Corporal Martinez, Lance Corporal Wilson, and Private First Class Dawson." Frank's hand twitched, muscle memory kicking in as he returned the salute, though his arm trembled slightly from the weight of Bravo and the years that had worn him down. His eyes darted between the Marines, searching for answers, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. Lieutenant Harris stepped forward, his voice steady but warm, laced with an emotion that caught Frank off guard. "Sir," he said, "Bravo pulled me out of a compound in Ramadi when my team was pinned down. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter, even when the bullets were flying. And you never abandoned him, not even when regulations would have torn you apart." Harris's voice cracked slightly, betraying the depth of his gratitude. "You fought for him, kept him by your side when the system would have discarded him. Now it's our turn to make sure neither of you is left behind." The 5 Marines raised their hands in unison, saluting again, their gestures encompassing both Frank and Bravo. The dog, too weak to lift his head, let out a soft whimper, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Frank's throat tightened, his eyes stinging as he fought to keep his composure. He'd spent years burying his emotions, hardening himself against a world that often turned its back on him. But this was different. These men saw him, saw Bravo, not as relics of a forgotten war, but as brothers who'd served and sacrificed. "We're here to transport you both to the Naval Veterinary Hospital at Bethesda," Reynolds continued, his tone firm but kind. "Bravo has been reactivated to honorary service status under the Battle Buddies Forever program. Full medical care has been authorized." The words hit Frank like a wave, relief and disbelief crashing over him. He looked down at Bravo, whose breathing was so faint it barely stirred the air. "He can hardly stand," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "He may not make it." Corporal Martinez stepped forward, his young face softened by compassion. "Sir," he said gently, "we're prepared for that. We brought a specialized transport from the SUV." He gestured toward the vehicle where the Marines retrieved a stretcher designed for canine patients. It was sturdy yet padded, built with care to ensure comfort. Frank's hands shook as he helped them transfer Bravo, his fingers lingering on the dog's fur, as if afraid to let go. The Marines worked with practiced precision, securing Bravo with straps that were firm but gentle, their movements reflecting a deep respect for the dog who'd once been a warrior in his own right. Frank watched, his heart swelling with gratitude and grief, knowing this might be Bravo's last journey. As they prepared to move, Frank's thoughts drifted to the videos, those clips that had spread online, capturing his quiet moments with Bravo and turning them into something for strangers to judge. "The people who recorded those videos," he began, his voice hesitant, unsure if he wanted to know the answer. "Are being addressed, sir," Reynolds said flatly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "The Commandant himself saw the footage this morning. He had some choice words about respecting those who've served, 2-legged and 4-legged alike." Frank nodded, a flicker of satisfaction cutting through his exhaustion. He'd never sought attention, never wanted pity or praise, but the thought that someone in power cared enough to act, it meant something. As the Marines carried Bravo's stretcher toward the SUV, a small crowd of news vans began to gather, their cameras glinting in the sunlight. Reynolds stepped in front of them, his broad frame a barrier between the procession and the lenses. "This isn't a photo op," he said, his voice low but commanding. "This is about doing right by our own." The reporters backed off, though one, a young woman with a notepad, lingered at a respectful distance. She scribbled furiously, her eyes bright with emotion as she watched the Marines move with quiet dignity. The next day, her article would appear under the headline, "Dogs Can't Speak, but 5 Marines Stood Up for One Who Served." It was a story of loyalty, of bonds that transcended time and war, and of a man and his dog who'd finally been seen for the heroes they were. In the quiet hum of the veterinary hospital, Bravo, an aging war dog with a coat grayed by time, lay under the vigilant care of specialists in canine geriatric medicine. The staff moved with purpose, their hands steady but gentle, tending to the old hero round the clock. Bravo's eyes, clouded yet still sharp with the spark of a warrior, followed their movements. He was more than a patient to them. He was a symbol of loyalty, a living testament to sacrifice. Every beep of the monitors, every soft word from the veterinarians, seemed to carry the weight of his storied past, a past that had, until recently, been mocked by those who didn't understand. Across town, a young man, barely out of his teens, stood before a camera, his face pale and his voice trembling with the kind of regret that sinks deep into the bones. He was an ROC cadet, proud but now humbled, his uniform crisp yet somehow ill-fitting under the weight of his mistake. His commanding officer had pieced it together, connecting the cruel videos he'd posted online, videos that ridiculed an old man talking to his dog, to the truth about Bravo's identity. "I didn't get it," he stammered, his eyes darting nervously as he spoke to the world. "I thought he was just some old guy, chatting with his pet. I didn't know Bravo was a decorated war dog. I didn't know about the battles they'd fought together, the lives they'd saved. I'm sorry." His voice cracked, and behind his words was a storm of shame, a young man grappling with the realization that his careless laughter had wounded a hero. Meanwhile, in a quiet swell of determination, veterans from 3 neighboring states banded together, their hearts stirred by Frank and Bravo's story. These were men and women who knew the cost of service, who understood the unspoken bond between a soldier and their dog. They pooled their resources, called in favors, and leaned on connections forged through years of camaraderie. Within days, they'd secured a modest house for Frank, a place where he and Bravo could live without the burden of a mortgage, thanks to a veterans program that understood the debt owed to men like him. The house sat near a serene lake, its shores lined with gentle walking paths perfect for Bravo's frail legs. The local homeowners association, notorious for its strict rules against pets, had been swayed by the story of Frank and Bravo. In a rare moment of unity, they voted unanimously to waive their restrictions, their hearts softened by the tale of a man and his dog who had given so much. 2 weeks later, Bravo's condition had stabilized enough for him to leave the hospital. The staff, who had grown fond of the old dog's quiet dignity, organized a formal ceremony to mark the occasion. It wasn't just a discharge, it was a moment of recognition long overdue. Years ago, Bravo had been authorized a K-9 service medal, but the honor had never been formally presented. Now, in a room filled with the scent of antiseptic and the soft rustle of uniforms, Frank stood tall, his weathered face etched with pride and grief. Bravo, despite his age and the tremble in his limbs, sat at attention beside him, his eyes fixed on his handler as if he understood the gravity of the moment. The medal was pinned to a small vest draped over Bravo's back, and a military photographer captured the scene. In one frame, Bravo, as if sensing the solemnity, lifted his paw in what could only be described as a salute, a gesture so poignant it brought a hush to the room. Frank's chest tightened with a mix of joy and sorrow, his thoughts drifting to the missions they'd shared, the nights spent under fire, and the unspoken promise that had kept them together. As Frank and Bravo prepared to leave for their new home, a remarkable sight greeted them. The original 5 Marines who had served alongside Frank years ago stood waiting, but they weren't alone. Dozens more had joined them, veterans from conflicts spanning decades, their faces lined with the marks of time and experience. They formed 2 perfect lines outside the hospital, a corridor of honor stretching from the doors to the waiting transport. Frank, his steps slow but steady, walked between them, his heart swelling with a pride he hadn't felt in years. Bravo followed, his gait halting but determined, as if drawing strength from the reverence around him. Every Marine raised their hand in salute, not just to Frank, but to Bravo, whose courage had earned him a place among them. Master Sergeant Reynolds, his voice low but steady, met Frank's eyes as they passed. "Semper Fidelis," he said softly. "Always faithful, both of you." The words hit Frank like a wave, stirring memories of dusty battlefields and the Wendy who had never left his side. He nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. In their new home by the lake, Frank's days took on a new rhythm. Each morning he sat on the porch, the wood creaking under his weight, and read aloud to Bravo. The dog lay at his feet, his ears twitching at the familiar cadence of Frank's voice. Once, passers-by had mocked the sight, an old man talking to his dog, oblivious to the world. Now they saw something different. Neighbors nodded respectfully as they walked by, some pausing to offer a quiet greeting or a kind word. The neighborhood children, who had once been warned to steer clear of the strange man, now approached with curiosity and awe. "Can we visit Bravo?" they'd ask, their eyes wide with wonder. Frank, whose smile had once been a rare thing, welcomed them with a warmth that surprised even himself. He showed them how to approach Bravo gently, teaching them to respect the old dog's fragility. One small boy, clutching a toy soldier, looked up at Frank with a question that carried the weight of innocence. "Is your dog a superhero?" he asked. Frank's smile softened, his eyes crinkling with a tenderness he hadn't shown in years. "No, son," he said, his voice steady but warm. "He's just a Marine, like me." The local elementary school invited Frank and Bravo to their Veterans Day assembly. Public speaking wasn't Frank's strength. His voice was too rough, his memories too heavy, so he declined to take the stage. But he agreed to attend, sitting quietly at the back of the auditorium, while Bravo, wearing his service vest, accepted gentle pats from children who now understood that heroes didn't always wear capes. Some wore fur, their loyalty etched in every scar and gray hair. Frank watched, his heart a tangle of pride and gratitude, as the children whispered Bravo's story to one another, their voices filled with reverence. In the park where Frank had once endured ridicule, a small bronze plaque appeared one day, installed without fanfare but placed where all could see. It was dedicated to military working dogs and their handlers, its simple inscription reading, "Loyalty beyond words." Frank didn't know who had put it there, but he felt its weight every time he passed it. Bravo's leash loose in his hand. The final video to circulate online was a far cry from the first. It showed Frank and Bravo on their porch, the lake shimmering in the background, the old Marine reading softly to his dog. The cruelty of the past had been replaced by respect, the laughter by understanding. For Frank, it was enough to know that Bravo's story, their story, mattered. And for Bravo, it was enough to lie at his handler's side, faithful to the end. As the sun dipped low over the lake, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson, Frank sat on the weathered wooden bench, his silhouette blending into the fading glow. Beside him, Bravo, his old German shepherd, rested with a quiet dignity, his fur catching the last glimmers of daylight. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and the gentle lapping of the lake's waves provided a soft rhythm to the evening. Frank's heart felt heavy yet full, a mix of pride and sorrow that had settled deep in his bones over the years. He didn't need to look at Bravo to know the dog felt it too. Their bond was beyond words, forged through countless moments of shared silence and understanding. A group of young Marines still in their crisp uniforms had come to visit that day, their boots crunching on the gravel path as they approached the lake. They were full of energy, their voices loud with camaraderie, but there was a reverence in their eyes as they glanced at Frank and Bravo. These were active duty soldiers, men and women who carried the weight of their own stories, their own battles. Frank watched them from the corner of his eye, his weathered face softening with a flicker of recognition. He saw himself in them, decades younger, standing tall, ready to face whatever the world threw at him. Now his hands bore the creases of time, and his steps were slower, but his spirit remained unyielding, tethered to the same values that had guided him through his service. Bravo, too, seemed to sense the significance of the moment. His ears twitched slightly, and his deep brown eyes scanned the horizon, as if searching for something just beyond the reach of memory. Frank's hand rested gently on the dog's back, his fingers sinking into the familiar warmth of Bravo's fur. The touch was grounding, a reminder that they were both still here, still holding on to each other. Frank's mind wandered to the days when Bravo was younger, bounding through fields with boundless energy, his barks echoing through training grounds. Back then, Bravo had been more than a companion. He'd been a partner, a fellow soldier who'd faced danger at Frank's side. The memories brought a lump to Frank's throat, but he swallowed it down, his jaw tightening with quiet resolve. As the sun sank lower, its final rays casting long shadows across the water, an unspoken shift settled over the group. The Marines, who had been swapping stories and laughter moments before, fell silent, their eyes drawn to the horizon. It was as if the lake itself had hushed them, commanding a moment of reverence. Bravo stirred, lifting his muzzle to the sky. Then, without warning, he let out a howl, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to rise from the very core of his being. It was a cry that carried both grief and pride, a lament for those who were gone, and a tribute to the strength that endured. The sound pierced the stillness, echoing across the lake and into the hearts of everyone present. Frank's chest tightened as he listened, his hand still resting on Bravo's back. He could feel the vibration of the howl beneath his palm, a raw expression of everything they had been through together. The memories flooded back, nights spent under starless skies, the weight of duty pressing down, the faces of comrades who never made it home. Frank's eyes stung, but he didn't blink away the tears. He let them sit there, a silent acknowledgement of the cost of service, of the sacrifices that had shaped him into the man he was. Bravo's howl wasn't just for them. It was for every soldier, every companion, every soul who'd given themselves to something greater. The Marines stood frozen, their faces solemn. They understood. Many of them were veterans themselves, their own scars hidden beneath their uniforms. They knew the weight of that howl, the way it carried the pain of loss and the pride of perseverance. One young Marine, her eyes glistening, clutched the dog tags around her neck, her fingers tracing the embossed letters as if anchoring herself to the moment. Another, a grizzled sergeant with lines etched deep into his face, stared out at the lake, his thoughts drifting to battles fought and friends buried. The silence that followed Bravo's howl was profound, a shared recognition that some stories didn't need words to be felt. Frank glanced at the group, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. He didn't know their names, didn't need to. They were part of the same unbroken thread, a legacy of honor that stretched across generations. He thought of the countless others who'd stood where they stood, who'd faced the same fears and found the same strength. Bravo, too, seemed to understand, his head lowering as the last notes of his howl faded into the twilight. The dog's eyes met Frank's, and in that moment, they were two old souls bound by a shared history, their loyalty to each other as steadfast as ever. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving a soft purple glow in its wake. The Marines began to move, their voices low as they exchanged quiet words. But the moment lingered. Frank remained on the bench, his hands still on Bravo's back, feeling the slow rise and fall of the dog's breathing. He didn't need applause or recognition. The quiet companionship of his old friend, the weight of their shared past was enough. It was a reminder that honor wasn't just in the battles fought, but in the lives lived afterward, in the moments of stillness where memory and loyalty intertwined. As the stars began to prick through the darkening sky, Frank's thoughts turned to the future. He wondered who would carry these stories forward. Who would remember the sacrifices when he and Bravo were gone? The young Marines, perhaps, or others like them, those who understood that service wasn't just a moment in time, but a lifelong commitment. He looked down at Bravo, whose eyes were half closed now, content in the warmth of their bond. Frank smiled faintly, his heart full despite the ache. Some stories didn't need fanfare, only the quiet acknowledgement that they mattered. And in the gentle presence of an old bong and an aging man, an entire generation was reminded of what it meant to hold fast to honor, long after the battles had faded into memory.